This morning, I'm sick. I'm not feeling well. And instead of working on my agorist video, I've decided to make a rant video this morning, a sick rant video this morning, and today's subject is why no one understands what anarcho-capitalism is. Now, I've been a veteran anarcho-capitalist for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now. It's been a while. It's probably coming up to 5 years at this point that I've considered myself an anarcho-capitalist, even though technically nowadays I'm not. Technically nowadays I'm an agorist, but you'll see that video when it releases. Why does no one understand what anarcho-capitalism is? Anytime that someone runs into an Ancap online, it's usually a shouting match. I would know this because I'm usually on the opposite end, being shouted at for being an anarcho-capitalist. There's a lot of stereotypes about anarcho-capitalism. Greed and exploitation and mega corporations. Part of this confusion has a nugget of truth to it, an unfortunate nugget of truth. And to explain this, I'm going to briefly go over some anarcho-capitalist history. Well, there's several branches of the Rothbardians. You have more of a classic anarcho-capitalist. Someone who is more of a moderate anarcho-capitalist. There's a sort of a left-right spectrum within the anarcho-capitalist community. You have those who are more of just a classic, chill, typical, orthodox anarcho-capitalist would be influenced by Rothbard's works such as For a New Liberty, The Libertarian Manifesto, released in 1973, or The Ethics of Liberty, which I believe was released in 1984. So this era of Rothbard, the 70s and 80s, was an era after the 60s, which Rothbard had a more left-leaning bent to his philosophy. And right before 90s Rothbard, which Murray Rothbard had a more right-wing paleo-libertarian bent to him. You have those Ancaps who would like to call themselves paleo-libertarians or Hoppians. These are the anarcho-capitalists who are influenced by later Rothbard, such as 90s Rothbard, where he abandoned his New Left alliance from the 60s and embraced the Old Right alliance from the 90s. And with this new alliance, his most infamous successor, Hans Hermann Hoppe, who's a very controversial figure, has his own flavor of anarcho-capitalism. And I would argue, just based on my anecdotal evidence, most modern ANCAPs today are of a Hoppian variety or flavor to some degree. And so this gives anarcho-capitalism a right-wing aesthetic to it, a right-wing flavor to it. And so many people who are interacting with self-proclaimed anarcho-capitalists are usually interacting with people who are culturally right, although that's not entirely true. The anarcho-capitalists are a bit of a diverse bunch. You can find many people with many different cultural beliefs from both the left flavors and the right flavors. And on the opposite end of the Hoppians, you have who they call themselves the left Rothbardians, or also more of a sub-branch, the agorists. The defining difference between this left-right divide is, one of them is how they approach politics and our current economic system. Well, ANCAPs more on the right end are much more in favor of our current political system, more of an Americanism favoritism, more of a I hate the communists, and usually a lack of understanding of their classical anarchist roots, such as anarchists from the 1800s like Joseph Proudhon, Benjamin Tucker, Lysander Spooner, Bakunin, Kropotkin, a lack of understanding of their own tradition, because, well, if I would argue that the Hoppians are not anarchists, but that might be a video for another day. But they have generally distanced themselves from their more broader anarchist tradition. Many Hoppians don't even call themselves anarchists. Many Hoppians pretty much are what we would call minarchists, which is a belief of in a minimal state. Often their idea and their vision of an anarchist or libertarian society is very authoritarian. Usually they like to emphasize a voluntary authoritarianism in their hypothetical libertarian community, which just goes to show how much corruption there is within the anarcho-capitalist community. But this is not reflective of all anarcho-capitalist or more broadly Rothbardians. While on the right side, these Hoppians or paleo-libertarians are more likely to be in favor of current American economic order, and they envision an anarchist society as if it was supposed to be like what we have now, but with no taxes and no regulations, but we'll still have more or less the same economic order that we have with the same hierarchical business structures. And this is generally because there's been sort of a lacking need within Austrian economic theory for more leftist interpretation of economic theory. Lack of imagination, I would say, of like how an anarchist society would function. I think a lot of anarcho-capitalists, especially of the Hoppian variety, lack the imagination of what an anarchist society could look like, what a truly free market could look like, a market without government. That would look nothing like our current economic order at all. That we would not have these fast food chains and super malls and wide roads and this infrastructure of, anti-human size, that everything needs to be drivable and nothing is walkable, everything needs to be paid for, etc., etc. The current economic world that we live in is aesthetically very anti-human. A lot of anarcho-capitalists think that they need to propose that everything will be relatively the same but better in an anarcho-capitalist society, rather than taking the radical pill that nothing will ever be the same, and we truly will not know what an anarchist society will really look like. We can only really speculate, because economic theory is not a glass ball into the future, never will be. The future is unpredictable. And especially such as a global civilization without statism has never really been seen before. We don't know what a modern civilization would look like without statism. I think also a lot of Hoppians fail to understand the amount of, I guess you could say, the extent of what is statism. They think statism is limited to government agencies, politicians, bureaucrats, but they fail to consider that there are other hidden branches of government, such as megacorporations, who rely on government regulations to prop up their oligarchies. Some people, more of the left Rothbardian variety, would argue this, and they would argue from an Austrian economic perspective, but many Austrian economists don't really recognize this. Again, like I said, it's more of a lack of imagination. A major misconception about anarcho-capitalism is that no one understands what the anarcho-capitalist means by capitalism. And I quote Gary Chartier, who is of more of a left Rothbardian type, or no, actually, I don't even know what kind of anarchist Chartier is, but he has a very good triple meaning definition of capitalism, so I'll quote him. Gary Chartier talks about 3 types of capitalism, which he dubs capitalism 1, 2, and 3. First, capitalism 1 is an economic system that features property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services. Capitalism 2 is an economic system that features a symbiotic relationship between big business and government. And Capitalism 3, rule of the workplace of society, and if there is one, the state by capitalists, that is, by a relatively small number of people who control investable wealth and the means of production. Hoppians will see capitalism sort of as a capitalism 1 and 3, that being capitalism of free trade and voluntary exchange, and a capitalism 3 that free trade and voluntary exchange will naturally have a worker boss-ism of a small number of capitalists controlling capital and the majority of people remaining as workers. But many on the left Rothbardian spectrum, such as the Agorists, would probably define capitalism more as a capitalism 2 and 3, meaning that capitalism is an economic system that features a symbiotic relationship between big business and government, and the worker bossism. In my anecdotal observation, left Rothbardians usually like to avoid the terms capitalism and socialism altogether. Some have opted for the term freed, F-R-E-E-D, freed markets, to even separate from the term free markets, because usually when people think of free markets, they think of free market capitalism. And when they think of free market capitalism, they think of capitalism. And when they think of capitalism, they think of this current economic order, which none of the Rothbardians, from paleo-libertarians to left Rothbardians, support the current economic order, even if the right Rothbardians have sort of a mixed bag, confused conception of what they should support. So many agoras simply reject the label of capitalism. And why do we reject the label of capitalism? Why do some Rothbardians go one way and embrace the label of capitalism? Why do some Rothbardians reject the label of capitalism altogether? Some may even go to the extreme of calling themselves socialists. Well, it's a bit of a complicated history. You see, capitalism has always been a troubled term. Originally, from the early 1800s or so, the first definition of capitalism emerged more like a definition capitalism 3. Historically, capitalism in the beginning has been more like a rule of workplaces society, and if there is one, by the state, by capitalists, where there's a small people who control capital and most of the people remain as workers. And this, by the way, this definition, capitalism 3, is supposed to be a neutral term to capitalism 1 and 2. It can hypothetically work with both capitalism 1 and capitalism 2. Although the difference is that the more right-leaning Ancaps would argue that capitalism 3 emerges out of capitalism 1, and the left Rothbardians would argue that capitalism 3 emerges out of capitalism 2. But I digress. By the time that the anarchist movement was starting to roll, both in the European tradition, such as Kropotkin and Bakunin and Proudhon, and of the American tradition, such as Benjamin Tucker, Lysander Spooner, Voltairine de Cleyre, which, for historical context, the anarcho-capitalists are most influenced by the Bostonian anarchists that I've mentioned, Lysander Spooner, Benjamin Tucker, Voltairine de Cleyre, etc., etc. These early, what I dub classical anarchists, viewed capitalism more like capitalism 2, that it's an economic system that features a symbiotic relationship between big business and government. By the time we see anarcho-capitalism emerge onto the scene around the 50s and 60s, and ever since then has been gaining steam. Rothbard, the founder of what we now call anarcho-capitalism, combined the theories of natural law philosophy, which he derives as inspiration from Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, and also was influenced by the philosophy of Ayn Rand, although he had major divergence from Ayn Rand on many different things, especially politics, as Rothbard was an anarchist and Ayn Rand was still a statist. But Rothbard decided to adopt the label capitalism to mean free markets without government intervention. This decision was made because he was inspired by the Austrian School of Economics and of Ayn Rand's influence on Rothbard, and that the Austrian school adopted the label capitalism to mean pretty much minimal government intervention. And this is because that many of the Austrians were arguing against Marxists, and Marxists obviously have a very pro-totalitarian bent to them, especially of the Leninist variety and the Stalinists and the Maoists, and it gets way worse. So you're in the early 1900s, you're an Austrian economist, you're F.A. Hayek, you're Ludwig von Mises, Bombark, etc., etc. And socialism as a label evolved to pretty much mean something very totalitarian, something very different from what the classical anarchists thought of socialism. And so, as you're an Austrian economist, naturally the opposite of socialism is capitalism. And if the opposite of socialism is capitalism and socialism means basically superstatism, then capitalism must mean very small statism, very small government, very minimal government, perhaps maybe even virtually no government. And Rothbard naturally took these ideas to its logical conclusion that capitalism must mean no government. If we were to truly be consistent and we were to truly have a free market, we would have to have no government whatsoever. And thus, anarcho-capitalism was born. But this creates a lot of confusion with many of the other anarchists within the anarchist tradition, because the other anarchists have adopted the opposite label, socialism, who embrace the label socialism for their ideas. Even though these ideas are very similar, the ideas of voluntary association and do not aggress upon others, especially when you relate the anarcho-capitalists to the Bostonian tradition of anarchism, very similar. Very similar. The Bostonian anarchists supported free markets. It's just that there's lots of disagreements on economic theory, as the anarcho-capitalists are Austrians. And you know what, side tangent, just for clarification, some people call themselves anarcho-capitalists but do not adopt an Austrian economic theory. We call those people frauds. Moving on. So let's recap. Capitalism 3 emerged around the early 1800s, which Capitalism 2 emerged around the later 1800s with the anarchist tradition, and Capitalism 1 is pretty much almost exclusively an anarcho-capitalist idea, which emerged out of the 50s and 60s. And this lesser capitalism one, a sort of capitalism of minimal government, what we can dub free market capitalism, emerged around the crowd of the non-anarcho-capitalist Austrian economists, such as Ludwig von Mises, amongst the Randians or the objectivists, and amongst the Chicago School of Economics, which includes figures such as Milton Friedman, and then that obviously then naturally leads into Reagan-style economics and Thatcher-style economics, and from then, and now we hit the modern day, we have this confused, maggled, anti-concept that we call capitalism. What do I mean by an anti-concept? Well, to put it briefly, an anti-concept is a concept with multiple contradictory essences. For example, people typically associate capitalism with both our current economic system and with the label free markets, which, from an anarcho-capitalist perspective, is very problematic. Even if you are of more of a Hoppian style, it's still problematic, because now you're advocating for free markets, but people will hear you say, I like free markets, and then they look around, it's like, free markets like our current economic system? What are you, some sort of fascist? At least, when you talk to people online, they'll probably go to that extreme. The common conception of capitalism would probably go something like this. Oh, capitalism means free markets, like our current economic system, like the USA. The USA is a capitalist society, and that's what anarcho-capitalists wants. Anarcho-capitalists just want more capitalism. They just want more USA-style, Reagan-style economics. I'm describing more of the subconscious thoughts of non-anarcho-capitalists who do not understand what anarcho-capitalism means. Because the common conception of capitalism is an anti-concept, if you want to un-anti-concept capitalism, you basically got to go either capitalism 1, which usually is a capitalism 1 and capitalism 3 pair, or you go capitalism 2, which is usually paired with capitalism 3. I propose a solution to this conundrum. I say that we define capitalism purely in capitalism 3 and disregard capitalism 1 and 2. I think that's a principled compromise in my opinion. Nevertheless, this language barrier has created a lot of problems, both with non-anarchists interacting with anarcho-capitalists, and anarchists who are not part of the Rothbardian branch interacting with anarcho-capitalists. Pretty much the only non-anarcho-capitalists who actually understand anarcho-capitalists are the left Rothbardians or the agorists, probably because an agorist was in the past an anarcho-capitalist. Now, when it comes to most people, it's just gonna be a very hard discussion to have about anarchism in general, let alone anarcho-capitalism or Rothbard's ideas. But not all hope is lost. I do believe there are some people out there, and especially I am referring to those non-Rothbardian anarchists, to be open-minded, recognize that there are many anarcho-capitalists who would probably be your friends, and how we would probably profit from each other if we have a civil sit-down conversation and actually try to understand each other. This issue is compounded by tenfolds by especially like extreme Hoppians. We can call them neo-reactionary, the mole bug types, the types that have pretty much abandoned the idea of libertarianism a while ago and are just drifting more and more and more towards a black and yellow style fascism. But I'd say to those anarchists out there, maybe don't have a conversation with the Hoppians. A lot of them are a lost cause. Have a conversation with your more typical anarcho-capitalists, and especially have a conversation with the more left Rothbardian agorist types. As I see it, damn, this is like, someone's fucking beeping. I gotta close this fucking window. Motherfucker, interrupting my fucking video. Well, this is pretty much the end of my video, I guess. I'm gonna just go be sick and be miserable.